Hello, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will be your driver on this journey. Today, I wanted to take a look at another tournament going on currently in the chess world. And we've still got tons and tons of these world-class online events going on with all the players that you would expect. The one going on right now, of course, is the Chessable Masters tournament, and they actually just wrapped up the preliminary stage of the events yesterday, I believe. Now, the way the preliminary stage worked is there were two groups of players. There were 6 players in Group A, 6 players in Group B, and then the top 4 players from each group moved on to the quote-unquote playoffs. So on the final day, there were actually multiple players in situations where they absolutely had to win their game. So I wanted to look at 2 of the notable ones. That is a game between Hikaru and Daniil Dubov, and a game between Grischuk and Harikrishna. And I wanted to see how these players actually chose to play their games when they knew they were under this much pressure, where they absolutely had to win their games to advance. So let's jump into it here. In game 1, I wanted to look at Hikaru against Dubov, because this is really sort of the main event of the final day. Hikaru was, I believe, on 4 points. Dubov was on 5 points. And with just a draw, I believe Dubov would have secured his place in these playoff matches. So Dubov has the black pieces, needs only a draw against Hikaru. Hikaru absolutely must win if he is going to advance. So how did they play this game? Well, Hikaru chooses 1e4, and this is no surprise. A lot of the time when somebody has the white pieces and they absolutely must win, e4 is sort of the go-to. That's not to say you can't score wins with d4 or c4, or even knight f3, but e4 is sort of the default fallback to try and actually prove an advantage with white. And then Dubov, interestingly, goes with c5, and this is a decision that could very easily be criticized if you are a fan of Dubov, because Dubov chooses a very combative line that you would expect if he was playing black in his own must-win situation, or something like this. When he only needs a draw, you might, as a Dubov fan, have wanted to see something like e5, you know, the Petrov, the Berlin, or something like this. But no, he goes with c5. And I'm actually going to defend this decision by Dubov, even though it didn't work out for him here today. When you are, you know, the 2700 level player that Dubov is, against your biggest rivals in rapid chess, it's more important for you, I think, to get a position that you're familiar with and comfortable with, more than getting sort of this dead drawn position that you would want in a must, or in a draw, in a situation where a draw is enough. I don't know if there's a term for that one. It wasn't necessarily a must draw, but he needed at least a draw to secure his place. So it's more important, I think, to get a position you're familiar with, as I said, than it is to get a position that's sort of dead. And Dubov has been playing this line, I think, quite regularly for some time now. In the game, it continued knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, and g6. So we have, of course, the accelerated dragon appearing on the board after d4, cd4, knight takes d4, bishop g7, and bishop e3. So of course the dragon is with d6 included. The accelerated dragon is where black delays playing d6 in an effort to play d5 in one fell swoop. This is sort of the idea of the accelerated dragon. Now, Dubov continues with knight f6, which is by far the main move. We have bishop c4 by white, which is sensible, playing to control the d5 square. Excuse me. We have castles by black. We have bishop b3, the main line, by white. And then Dubov pulls out this move, which he's actually played before, and is quite an interesting one, even though it is not the most common. Here, Dubov plays the move rook to e8. And this rook e8 move is definitely a sideline in this dragon position. Quite often, players will transpose to the normal dragon with d6 here, allowing f3. When you go into quite often some Yugoslav attacks, I believe, there's also, of course, the move a5, which is sort of the second option for black, playing on the king side here, or the queen side here. but this move rook e8 has definitely been tested for some time now. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe, I'm no expert dragon player, but I believe the point of this rook e8 move is that after f3, it's actually quite possible to play d5 in that one fell swoop, as black had always intended. And after d5, you go down a very forcing line. E takes d5, knight b4 hits this pawn. Knight d to e2 is the choice to defend it. Then e6, d6 is quite common for white here, although here the variations do start to branch. And Dubov actually has a game that he drew against Fabiano Caruana that went d6, knight bd5, and after regaining the pawn, Dubov did manage to draw this one, I think without too much controversy in this game. However, this is not what we saw in this game against Hikaru. Rather than go for this f3 business, this is sort of probably what Dubov was hoping for. This is what he was more familiar with. Hikaru actually comes up with a bit of a novelty here. And I've said before, this is the danger that you run into at these top levels when you do consistently play the same things over and over again. It's a problem Hikaru himself had run into by playing the same QGD line over and over again. When these top players know what to expect from you, they can very, very much do some serious homework and surprise you a bit with a move you may have not analyzed as thoroughly as needed. And so here, Hikaru pulls out a big novelty with the move f4. And undoubtedly, I think Dubov has probably looked at this move at some point in his life, even though it's never been played. This is definitely one of those natural moves that you should check if you're at the level of Daniil Dubov. In the game, he chose the move d6, which I think is quite natural, and now Hikaru follows up with queen f3. And the point of white's play so far is that he has not yet committed this king to either side of the board. He's sort of waiting to do this until black either starts wasting tempi with more waiting moves or until he commits to a more serious option. For example, if Dubov ever tries to play the move d5, well, in this case, the move e5 is going to be quite strong. And the point is, now we have this g1 square for the bishop to defend our knight. Now imagine instead if white castled here, and the move d5 came on the board. Now e5, knight g4. All of a sudden, this is significantly more awkward for white to deal with, the g1 square not available to the bishop. That's not even to say that d5 would be the best move. In fact, perhaps knight g4 immediately would even be good. Also, instead of queen f3, if castles, or after queen f3, if the same idea, knight g4, yes, this g1 square is available, but even this is not necessarily the best that white can do. Even the move knight takes c6, bc6, bishop back to d2 is totally playable, and black is just left in this sort of limbo where he doesn't want to commit to too much too early on. Another sort of useful move that you would expect from black is occasionally the idea to play this move e6. However, the second that e6 lands on the board, this is where Hikaru is no longer castling kingside, but instead has the opportunity to castle queenside, thereby getting his king out of the center and immediately pressuring this d6 pawn all in one turn. And this is sort of the power of the move order that Hikaru has chosen here. By delaying this idea of castling the king, he gives himself very useful options to castle either queenside or kingside, depending on black's choices. Now, in my opinion, sort of the default in this position is actually to castle kingside with the white king. And so after we see the move bishop d7 by black, that's exactly what Hikaru does. He castles kingside. And now sort of the point, I think, that Hikaru has made is that if he had castled rather than play queen f3, rather than play the move f4, the point he's trying to make is that black would be making much more useful moves than bishop d7 with this tempo, specifically this move knight g4. And so by delaying this castling, he's kind of baited Dubov into playing the move bishop d7, which, I mean, in its own right is not a bad move. It's sort of a waiting move. But on the other hand, it's not the most useful move Black could have made. So in a sense, Black is sort of losing tempo by playing this move bishop d7 here. And Hikaru uses this extra tempo to sort of launch an even more powerful attack than you would expect in the dragon. So White castles kingside immediately, Black plays knight g4, and now we have knight takes c6, b takes c6, and bishop d2. So this is still well within what we would expect kind of so far from this game. Black immediately after White goes ahead and castles does go in for this knight g4 line, forcing this bishop back to d2. And now that White has castled and he's gotten this knight out of the way, he is more comfortable playing this move d5. Now for Hikaru, he does have various options here. One choice is to capture this pawn, c takes d5, but the issue is no matter how you take this pawn back, you're always going to have some slight awkwardness with this bishop targeting this b2 pawn. For example, if you take with the knight immediately, bishop takes b2 is definitely a move you have to look out for, have to consider. So it's not really a true pawn sacrifice in many of the cases for Black. I suppose in this case it is a bit more of a serious pawn sacrifice, but I don't think Black is at all unhappy after rook c8. Targeting this knight on c3, targeting this pawn on b2. Definitely a lot of compensation there. So that's one choice for Hikaru, but I don't think he liked that one quite as much. The move e5 is also a choice for Hikaru, but I sort of think this is what Dubov was hoping for. You can imagine the game could continue with something like queen b6 check, king h1, and a move like h5. And now Dubov is sort of trying to consolidate and defend these light squares with a move like knight h6 to follow. That's not to say this isn't still a very decent position for White. He can start playing on the queen side with ideas of knight a4 and knight c5, but Black is at least not getting rolled over on the king side. However, Fabiano, or in this case Hikaru, not Fabiano, sort of chose door number 3. So who in the chat room can guess the move that Hikaru played? Sort of the third candidate move that you should consider in this position. Who thinks they have it? So yeah, the chat room is accurate here. The move is going to be f5 in this case. h3 is actually also a very good move worth considering, but in this case, I do think let's stick with f5. h3, just sort of a tempo move to get rid of this knight before making any decisions. So f5 in this case was played in the game, and I think already from what I can tell, Dubov has a rather uncomfortable position right out of the gate here. Perhaps this was sort of his last chance to kind of recover. He could have played the move g takes f5, and after e takes f5, knight back to f6. And I still don't like this position for Black, but with this knight on f6, Black is guarding most of these key squares. He is going to come under some fire on the g file, and this e pawn is going to be slightly uncomfortable. But you can imagine, after, let's say, some solid improving move by White, the move e6 by Black could be coming, and after rook takes e6, Black is sort of trying to survive by breaking out along this e file. Is he going to succeed? It's still kind of unclear to me, and it would require a lot more analysis than I've done to tell you the objective truth of that position. But I sort of think this was Dubov's kind of last try to stay in the game here. After f5, understandably Dubov goes knight to e5, but this is just sort of the incorrect defensive setup for Black here. And the reason for that is this f6 square is going to be too critical in this position. It's the f6 square where White does end up breaking through, and it's the square that is causing the problems for Black. So knight to e5, of course, we don't want to move this queen over to g3 or h3. We want to move it back to f2 because f6 is now sort of our target. We want to continue attacking the square. In the game, Dubov plays e6, and this sort of just immediately loses the game to the move f6. Now, after knight g4, a sort of clever move, forking queen and pawn at first glance. Unfortunately, the move queen f3 is just going to be devastating in this case. The idea being, if you do capture on f6 as you want to, the move e5 is quite nasty. And all of a sudden, the battery along the f-file is coming through. Play could continue, knight e4, knight takes e4, d takes e4, queen f7 check, king h8. And this is a position that Dubov could try to play. Obviously, this one is going to be quite good for white. And after simply queen f4, c5, queen takes e4, Nakamura would have just collected an extra pawn with a safer king and control over the f7 square. Really devastating stuff for Dubov here. In the game, he tried the move queen takes f6, but of course this just goes down a piece after queen g4 check, queen takes g4, queen d4 check, rook f2, f5, queen f3, takes on e4. And while Dubov did get the strong center, he's actually losing a second piece in this case. e3 would regain one of the pieces, but it's only one of the pieces. And so eventually Nakamura does go on to win this game. Queen takes e6, rook over to f8, challenging this rook, bishop e1, queen e3. And at the end of the day, knight takes d5, queen e2, and queen e5 check was all Dubov needed to see before throwing in the towel and resigning here. Queen e5 check, of course, a very nasty move, diverting this bishop away from the pin so white can recapture the queen on e2. So the moral of this game is basically don't fall into Nakamura's prep, because Nakamura had some very, very good prep here. And this is, I believe, posing some very serious problems to this entire idea of rook e8. It's not to say that there isn't a way for black to still equalize against this move rook e8, but I spent some serious time looking around, and I'm not so sure that I found the way to equalize after this idea, f4 and queen f3. Pretty nasty stuff. Perhaps the best line that I had found was in fact to play this move knight g4, and play might continue knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop d2, and then believe it or not, the move knight f6 is actually well worth considering. The point being, now if you do castle kingside, we can get something similar to what we've already seen after the move d5. Now, unfortunately for white, the move f5 is going to come with much less gusto after d takes e4, knight takes e4, and bishop takes f5. So I think bringing this knight back to f6 is actually a very serious consideration. Now the move e5 would still be playable, and perhaps this is what white should be going for. But I think after knight d7, black might be holding on here. Immediately, the move e6 isn't going to be good enough. You can simply capture this and take back control of the e5 square. And if e6 immediately doesn't work, then sort of this entire attack on the king's side is beginning to slow down a bit for white. So this is the best I could find for black, is simply going knight g4, and after the exchange, repeating moves with knight f6. Maybe the move h3 is good enough for white, just to stop knight g4 and still even further delaying castling. And now the move d5 would in fact be met with e5. And after queenside castles, this stuff with g4 and f5 is coming quite quickly. But it's still unclear to me what's going on exactly in this position. And I'll leave that to Dubov and Dubov's team to figure out. I'm sure next time this gets played over the board, we will see a little bit more astute defense from the black side. With that in mind, very excellent game from Nakamura, and this is just what you have to do if you are in a must-win situation. Naka ready to risk it all, exposing his super secret rook e8 prep and going for an immediate kingside attack, not afraid to increase the tension in the position, get something super complex. That's what you have to do in a must-win situation. Moving along, more bad news for Dubov. Even though he lost this game against Hikaru Nakamura, if in this second game Alexander Grischuk had not defeated Pentala Harikrishna, then Dubov would still be in the playoffs. But unfortunately for Dubov, Grischuk wins this game as well, bringing him into a tie with both Hikaru and Dubov all on 5 points, and Dubov, with the worst tiebreaks, did end up not qualifying. So that being said, Grischuk himself was also in a must-win situation here, and I wanted to examine how he did it as well. So, in this game, we did see the move d4, As I've said, e4 usually the fallback when they're in a must-win situation. Not to say you can't score wins with d4 and c4 either. In this particular game, Harikrishna goes for knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, and now c5. And I think this is partially down to the tournament that Harikrishna was having. He had some very unfortunate losses early on, and at this point I think he was just too far out of the leaders in order to catch up and qualify for the playoffs. I've got to stop wearing this jacket during these classes. So he chose a more fun opening than good opening in the Benoni, although the fun part is questionable. d5 is the move played by Grischuk, and once again, this is what you have to do in a must-win situation. You have to play the most contesting lines. You have to go for as much as you possibly can out of the opening to get a position that could result in a win. In this game, we saw e takes d5, c takes d5, and then Harikrishna does something very interesting that I've actually seen before, not from any of the top grandmasters, but instead from my old teammate on the U of I chess team. And that thing that he does is he just doesn't play d6 for quite a few moves. And me being the fool that I am, always try to find some way to punish my opponent for not playing d6. In this game, though, you'll see the correct approach by Grischuk, which is just saying, why are you doing this, and going about your business, developing normally. So Harikrishna plays g6 rather than d6, and now after knight c3, rather than d6, Harikrishna plays bishop g7, and now after e4, rather than d6, Harikrishna castles, and now after bishop d3, rather than d6, Harikrishna plays the move rook e8, and then white simply castled in this case. And Harikrishna finally relented, saying, okay, fine. I will play the move d6. And I'm not sure what advantage Harikrishna was hoping to attain by delaying this move. Perhaps he was trying to avoid some of the more annoying lines involving bishop f4 and going after this pawn immediately. But whatever his reasons may be, he plays d6 now, and we are very much back into a normal-looking position after d6. The only slightly strange thing is that black has played rook e8 very, very early on, rather than play a move like a6, going for b5, a move like knight bd7, or a move like bishop g4. And because of that, I think black's options are quite limited here. Because black delayed playing d6 for so long, bishop g4 is no longer available to him. And to ensure this, Grischuk actually plays the move h3. And I think this is a great idea by Grischuk, just keeping this bishop out of g4 now forever. And this move also steers the game back into very, very normal territory. This is just a well-known position now in the Benoni. And Harikrishna goes for a line which, for lack of a better word, I think just loses by force. And Grischuk found the way to punish this. In this game, Harikrishna plays the move c4. And Grischuk plays the most forcing line. The line with bishop c2 is definitely playable, and this has been played before, well over 100 times actually. But this is sort of giving black what he wants. He wants to play b5 here, tempting you into accepting this pawn when knight takes e4 would follow on the board, and things become a little bit more open, a little bit more free. Rather than that, though, Grischuk just captures this pawn on c4, and now black is sort of forced to capture on e4. This was the point of his play. Now after knight takes e4, we have rook takes e4, and suddenly the move bishop d3 appears on the board. And it's not so clear where this rook is actually going. Now, generally, the move bishop g5 has actually been played a bit more often here, and after bishop f6, then bishop d3. But this does allow stuff like queen f8 to actually come on the board, so Grischuk plays bishop d3 first, trying to perhaps avoid an option like queen f8. Rook e8 is just the best square on the board for this rook, and now after bishop g5, we do see bishop f6. Grischuk continues with the move queen a4, which sort of counters one threat with another. Now, after bishop takes g5, which is played in the game, we have knight takes g5, and this is just a very tough position now for black. Perhaps the best try is to just continue development with a move like knight d7. You're going to get met with a move like knight e4, and all of a sudden it's very, very difficult to meet this threat. You don't really want to be playing knight c5 here, as already there is a second threat in the position. So you're more than a little stuck here. I think you have to play a move like rook e5. And after rook e1, this is, like I said, going to be rather uncomfortable for black here. Now in the game, rook e5 was played immediately, and I would like to invite you guys at home to find the winning sequence here for Alexander Grischuk that he did find in the game. There's only one line that does it, but Grischuk managed to find it. What do you guys think? White to move and win. There's a couple suggestions. Rook a to e1 has been suggested. The move queen f4 has been suggested. This move is pretty interesting, but I think it does in fact fail to not bishop or rook takes g5, not even queen takes g5, which would allow the move f4, but rather the move bishop d7, when all of a sudden your queen's attacked, the e8 square is defended, and you might be facing rook takes g5 next. So interesting move there, not quite it. The move queen f4 does in fact actually just allow the capture of this knight, unfortunately. So you have to do a little bit better than that, guys. You got it. Yeah, Beltran has it. August has it, or Auguste. I don't know how to say things. And it's the move f4. And so why does this move actually win? Well, after the move rook takes d5, which is more or less forced by black. If you just kind of retreat, you're asking for the move f5 to come on the board, which is going to be devastating, with all files sort of opening up. So you have to kind of keep an eye on this f5 square. And now, unfortunately, the move played in the game, queen c4, is just more or less game over. There's nothing you can really do here. If you play the move bishop e6, it's just going to get captured, and then bishop e4. And you are getting crisscrossed all over the chessboard on the light squares after this. So in the game, Harikrishna plays rook takes g5, but after f takes g5 and bishop e6, the move queen f4 comes on the board, knight c6, and this is sort of just a dead loss position now for Harikrishna. That being said, there is still a technical task to be completed here for Grischuk, which he does very, very well. He starts with the move rook f2, just guarding all these squares along the second rank and preparing to bring this rook over to f1 if necessary. Also, actually preparing to tuck this bishop away back on f1. And it's this move that is actually played in the game after knight e5, and this is sort of really commendable by Grischuk. If you find yourself in sort of a rapid game or a little bit low on time, then priority number one, if you are sort of in a winning position, up material, is always going to be to protect the king. And that's exactly what Grischuk does with rook f2 and bishop f1. He says, I'm defending all of these squares. Do what you like elsewhere on the board. I'm making sure my king is safe first and foremost. I'm not going to blunder anything on this side of the board. And then I will slowly but surely convert my advantage. The move queen b6 comes on the board, pinning a rook to the king. And so, of course, Grischuk plays the move king h2, saying, yes, thank you for trying, but I'm not going to blunder anything on this side of the board. I'm making sure my king is safe. Rook c8 now comes on the board. And Grischuk continues very simply just limiting the activity of his opponent's pieces. He notices that this square is definitely something black would like to use, dropping a bishop here, dropping a knight here, and so the move b3 comes on the board, saying no, you may not have that c4 square as well. And it's this limiting play that really ensures nothing can go wrong here for white. The move rook c3 is allowed, but this is sort of an empty threat with all these squares being fairly well covered. And now just rook d1 by white, activating his final piece, putting pressure on the d6 pawn. Queen c7 was played in the game, and now king g1 was Grischuk's choice, sort of dropping the king back now that this pin is no longer a concern. The move a5 comes on the board, queen d4 puts even more pressure onto this guy, and now d5 was sort of the breaking point for Harikrishna. In fact, there is another winning tactic here for white, which I would like to invite you guys at home to try and find, because winning tactics are always fun to try and find. Grischuk did not actually find it in the game. Not that it mattered too much. Grischuk just sort of continued playing his very natural chess. But white to move and win even more here. What can you play to pick up this d5 pawn? Does anybody in the chat see it? August, like the month. Got it. Instead of rook takes d5, why not rook e3, threatening the bishop? I can back up and take a look at that. We will continue on to the end first, though. All right, nobody, I think, has the tactic just yet. I'm just going to show it because it's not of the utmost importance here. It is the very, very clever move, bishop c4, interfering with queen and rook and adding another attacker to the d5 pawn. Of course, this bishop cannot be captured, or else queen takes c3 will come on the board. And so rook g3 or something, and after the d5 pawn falls, it really is just game over. Instead, this was missed, and the move queen f4 was played, which is totally fine. And now after b6, the move rook e1 is sort of devastating for black. Knight d7, and one last time, white to move and win here. Go ahead, pause your videos if you want to try to find it yourself. If not, here it is. Rook takes e6 is the sort of last hurrah by white, just checkmating the black king in very, very short order. If queen takes f4, rook e8 check, and rook takes f4. If f takes e6, queen f7 check, king h8, and not queen f8 check, but queen e8 check, and rook f7 is another checkmate. So rook takes e6 is a game ender there, and Harikrishna resigns. And with it, also goes Daniil Dubov's chances of advancing to the playoffs with this win by Grischuk. Unfortunate for Dubov, but a well-played game, to be sure, by Alexander Grischuk. So these were two games where the players were in must-win situations with the white pieces, and this is exactly what you would expect to see from such high-level players. They came with their best games under pressure, using the most combative openings that they could find, and really tried to take it to their opponents. And in this case, they both succeeded, advancing on. Now, unfortunately, that was all the must-win games that I could find from the Chessable Masters, so I just wanted to move on to a couple more games that I just really enjoyed from the same tournament, the Chessable Masters. So let's move on to a game by Fabiano Caruana against Ian Nepomniachtchi. Now, while this technically may not be a must-win game, in hindsight, if Fabi didn't win this game, he would not have advanced to the playoffs, I think. So in hindsight, it was very, very important that he won the game. One could say he had to win the game. It was a must-win game. See? All right, so let's take a look. In this game, we complete our trifecta of white openings, not e4, not d4, but now c4. And in this game, Jan responds with knight f6, knight c3. We have e5, g3, and d5. And this is sort of the most combative try by black. In this case, not meaning the most complex try, going for a complicated position. Rather, this is black trying to equalize sort of right out of the gate by playing the most strictly principled moves right out of the opening as possible. e5, seizing the center. White plays the move g3, not attacking the center, so d5, also seizing the center. And so what this says is basically you have to prove something concrete with white, or else I'm going to be totally, totally equal with no issues at all. So in the game, c takes d5 is the main move, knight takes d5, and bishop g2. We have knight back to b6. This is all very mainline stuff. And now d3 by Fabi is a little bit less common than knight f3. But it does come with a very, very sneaky idea, actually. By delaying knight f3, Fabiano is sort of hinting that if you ever play this move knight c6, I might be so inclined as to capture this bishop, fracturing your pawns and playing this sort of endgame position. And this is something that has actually been tried before by high-level players. But in this game, Jan had no interest in going for things like that, playing bishop e7 instead. Bishop e3 by Fabi sort of continues this facade where if you play knight c6, I might just capture it, you never know, but just castles by Jan. And now even rook c1, still trying to tempt black into playing the move knight c6 when I still might capture it with my bishop. But instead, rook e8, and now finally we do see knight f3 by white, sort of relenting, saying, okay, fine, if you're going to play knight c6, play knight c6, and Jan happily does. Now, simply castles by white. We have bishop f8 by black, and bishop g5 by Fabi is an attempt to just force a little bit of awkwardness. Now, Jan plays a very, very sort of strange-looking move, rather than what may be quite simply the most natural move in the position of f6, kicking this bishop away, following it up with bishop e6, when you have a very solid structure on the king side with a perfect little home for the bishop. Jan plays the very non-standard looking move, queen d7. As to why Jan played this, I'm not so sure why he didn't want to play these f6 lines. Maybe he just wanted to keep his pawns absolutely where they are on the king side, not admitting any weaknesses. But basically the point is this isn't a bad move, so why not play it? Why isn't it a bad move, blocking in the bishop? Well, because it's not all that important for the moment. White is going to move this bishop again, and black is going to move this queen again. So is it really a loss of tempo if both sides are losing the tempo? I'm not so sure. Anyways, in the game, a3 was played, h6 was played, kicking this bishop back, and then this queen actually does come back to d8. And Jan has actually had this exact position with the white side before, so perhaps this is where he got this queen d7, queen d8 idea from. Now, in this game, the move knight e4 was played, which actually does follow Jan's game from 2017, then a5, and now Fabi does deviate from the game that Jan had. In Jan's game, he actually chose the move bishop e3. In Fabi's game, we instead see the move knight c5. And so what do we have in this middle game position here? Well, Jan has achieved something by getting the move a5 in. With a5, he's preventing white from seizing all of this queenside space with the move b4. Jan has also achieved something by getting the move d5 through. With d5 on the board, trading off the c-pawn for the d-pawn, he does have a lot of space for his pieces, including a wide open diagonal, 1 for this bishop and 2 for this bishop, which is something that can only be achieved by moving this pawn at least 2 squares, opening up both diagonals. So these are things that Jan has achieved. However, is Jan totally equalized here? This is sort of a question that is not quite as easy to answer. While the position may be equal, I would venture to say that black actually has a lot more practical problems here than white does. White can sort of make more comfortable moves like queen c2, moves like rook d1, moves like bishop back to e3 even if necessary. And in the meanwhile, it's sort of less easy to understand how black is actually going to finish development of this bishop on c8. Also not as easy to understand what exactly this knight is doing on b6 and what this rook is doing on a8. So these are sort of the last remaining problems for black. The reason it's so difficult to see what's going to happen to these pieces is because, as always, whenever white fianchettos this light squared bishop, it can easily turn into a monster piece, and that's what it's sort of threatening to do here, with all this pressure on the light squares along this long diagonal. So is Jan doing fine here? Yes, probably, but practically, he has a ways to go before he can sort of just sit comfortably. In this game, the move a4 was played, forever sort of locking down ideas of b4 with the move a takes b3. In the game, queen c2 by Fabi is just a natural, developing, improving move. And then we see Jan sort of play this move rook a7, which looks very unnatural and perhaps is an indication of the practical problems that black is facing here. That being said, things definitely have not gone wrong yet for Jan, and we do see the move rook f to e1 by Fabi. Now in this exact position, Jan makes a very committal decision. And this is why I think black's position was actually perhaps practically not doing as well as one might think, just by looking at the sort of more objective computer analysis, for example. If Jan plays a move like bishop e7, just sort of passing the time, it's not so clear what white is going to be doing. It's sort of a game of patience here, because if white is the one to kind of go crazy first and play a move like e4, well, now he's never going to get control of the d4 square back. If he plays a move like e3, this is potentially possible, but for the moment there are immediate tactical issues with it by hanging the d3 pawn. And if you try to prepare some of these ideas with something like bishop e1, well, then it's bishop f1 rather, then you're sort of just making your own piece worse. So it becomes this game where both players are going to try and prove that their position is improved to the max and there's not much else to do. For example, this is, while a very unusual way for a game to develop, it's actually not the most ridiculous here, because sort of whoever blinks first might actually be giving up a large portion of the equality, might be ending up in a worse position. In this case, Jan is the one who sort of flinched first, not playing these strange-looking moves like bishop e7 or rook back to a8, as the engine suggests, quite understandably, by the way. Instead, he plays the move knight d4, which is a concrete attempt not only to solve all of his problems, but in fact an attempt to say that white is the one with more issues here. After the move knight takes d4 and e takes d4, you can very easily imagine a world where this e2 pawn just ends up being a weak backwards pawn sort of forever with no sign of life. Now, unfortunately, after knight d4, knight takes d4, and e takes d4, Fabi is immediately able to sort of strike back and seize the initiative. So rather than even entertain these thoughts of this pawn not being able to move anywhere, Fabi immediately plays the move e4. Now, this central pawn majority was scary enough for Jan to snatch this pawn off the board. Now, after bishop takes e3, we do see the move c6. So this is black's attempt to just solve his problems immediately. He gets rid of the knight on c6, gets rid of the pawn on e4, and plays the move c6. And now after c6, he's trying to claim that the move bishop f5 or bishop e6 even will be comfortable equality for him, finishing his development. Unfortunately, that is just not the case here. And the reason that isn't the case is because he's given up quite a number of squares in exchange for this idea. Namely, he's given up the d4 square, he's given up the e4 square, and white is now about to make use of all of these things. Knight e4 comes on the board, and all of a sudden, this bishop springs to life as well, with c6 also notably giving up the b6 square. Now, just for example, if a move like rook a8, you're sort of really asking for trouble here. This is in fact a losing move due to bishop takes b6, queen takes b6, knight f6 check. And this is just game over. So natural moves like that to unpin don't quite work. The move rook a6 is actually potentially playable, but Jan wanted none of this, instead just developing with the move bishop e6. Now, however, once the floodgates have sort of been opened, there's no going back and closing them. And Fabi continues quite naturally with the move bishop c5, removing this defender of all the weakened dark squares in the black camp. This is an idea that you'll see when there is a fianchettoed bishop. Of course, black would love to trade off these light-squared bishops to further weaken the light squares in the white camp. But the idea holds true for weak squares anywhere on the board. This bishop is being very, very useful guarding the weakened dark squares made by putting these pawns on light squares. So if white manages to get rid of it, then those dark squares are going to be even more weakened. Rook a8 played in the game, bishop takes f8, rook takes f8, and now knight c5. And there's simply nothing to contest this knight anymore. In the game, Jan felt the need to come all the way back to c8, and it's quite clear that while he thought he was able to solve his problems with the move c6, his problems have definitely persisted, with this bishop having to come back, and once again, there are 3 pieces in the black camp that just look totally dominated by the white pieces. Rook e4 on the board for Fabi is now immediately sort of just gaining a pawn. Rook e8 was played, rook c to e1 was Fabi's choice, maintaining control of the e-file. Rook takes e4, rook takes e4, rook a5 hits this knight, and rather than try to cash in with a move like knight a4, this would actually fall victim to the move bishop f5. Fabi just maintains the balance and plays the move h3. And this is sort of nasty here. Now, bishop f5 still is not playable due to the knight takes b7 tactic, and black is just totally unable to move. He's quite frozen in this case. Perhaps his best try was playing the move knight d7, just giving up on this pawn on a4, but in fact this is just a clean pawn down for black, and this is going to be a very tough endgame to try to hold. Instead, he tried the move king f8, but now the move d4 comes on the board, another square given up by this 4 sequence that black went in for, and after rook a8, rook back to e1. This is a position that Fabiano Caruana is going to win a lot of the time if you give it to him. Just more central space, more active pieces anywhere on the board, control of the only open file, threats of queen h7. It's just devastating. I mentioned queen h7. It's quite relevant. You cannot capture this pawn due to this tactic. If g6, just queen takes h6 check, and rook e8 check to follow. So d4 is untouchable. Jan chose g6 to defend, and now simply queen d2, if I could play it, attacks h6, defends d4, king g7 now, queen up to f4, knight back to d7, and now knight e4. Fabi definitely not interested in trading off any of these passive black pieces for the active white pieces. Rook a5 was Jan's choice, but unfortunately for him, this goes into a forced losing sequence. So, knight d6 hits the f7 pawn, knight f6 is Jan's choice to defend, and now once again, chat room, white to move and win. See if you can find the victory here. Beltron says, why do these guys draw all the time except when Dubov needs them to draw? That's a fair point. That's a fair point. I think there's a lot of Dubov fans out there, myself included, who are very sad to see him not getting into the playoffs. But that's the way the cards fell this time. And everybody has the answer, of course. I sort of hinted at it with this f7 pawn. It's the devastating move, rook e8. This move dares black to take with the knight, when this is simply going to be an unstoppable mate threat. If queen takes d4, the very curious move, knight f6, is actually going to be unstoppable mate on either of these squares, and so you will have to give up this queen, and that will be the match. In the game, Jan tried queen d7, just going down the full bishop, but of course, down a full bishop is going to be enough. g5 removes the defender of this knight, but queen d2 is a nice tempo move, hitting the rook. Rook a6, queen b4 now reestablishes the connection to the knight. c5, dc5, and this knight is staying there forever. Rook takes d6 does regain the piece, but by this point, Fabi is up. Technically only 2 pawns, but these are very, very serious pawns that Fabi is up, and this is a very easy, technically winning endgame. Jan tries to create some kerfuffle around the white king, but none of it. Fabi's having none of it. He just starts pushing these guys up the board. d7 gets the queens off the board, and now up 2 pawns is simple enough for Fabi, pushing all the way to victory here. And so this was a nice win by Fabi Caruana. Not necessarily a must-win situation as the first 2 were, but I very much enjoyed this game. And now, as we have 10 minutes, I did want to cheat a little bit on the topic of tonight's lecture. Not that I've, I might have already cheated enough by including non-must-win games, but earlier in this game, I was watching the live broadcast, and Yasser Seirawan, a commentator of the game, mentioned a game that he had against Mikhail Tal that actually went with Tal going knight d4, white capturing on d4, as we saw in this game, e4, and the difference in that game is white did not immediately get this e4 move in. And in that game, Yasser was saying how he was under so much pressure and how Tal had obviously outplayed him, and then Tal offered him a draw. Yasser went back to his team's coach, because this was at an Olympiad, and consulted with his coach, and his coach told him, you know, you do what you want, and so Yasser declined the draw in the worst position. And, you know, there was a whole story there by Yasser Seirawan. If you want to hear the full story, you'll have to ask Yasser for it. But the long and short of it is that Yasser actually did manage to battle back in a similar position. So I wanted to take a look at that game, which I'm claiming is from the Chessable Masters, because it's a game of one of the commentators from the Chessable Masters. In reality, this is, I believe, from the 1980 Olympiad, but it's still a fun game nonetheless to wrap up on. We had c4, e5, and a very similar line here, knight c6, g3, and now d5, as we've seen, knight takes d5, d3, bishop e7, bishop g2. The difference in this case is Yasser didn't do any of this funny business with delaying knight f3, just sort of starting with that move. Bishop e6 now is, in fact, getting a slightly different position than before, with this bishop already leaving the defense of the b7 pawn. We had castles, castles, a3, queen d7, bishop up to d2. This is just very standard stuff, both at the time and still today. It would be pretty standard to see this being played. And now f6. And this is sort of the setup that Jan declined to go for in his game by leaving the bishop on c8 and playing this queen d7 to d8 move. And perhaps in hindsight, maybe this setup would have been a little bit simpler to go for, in fact. The move rook c1 came on the board for Yasser. Very similar stuff to what we see Fabi doing in the game that we just analyzed. Rook fd8 now by Mikhail Tal. And now the move b4 does come on the board. And so this is perhaps an advantage for white that we did not see in the Fabi game. Yasser does in fact get this b4 move through, whereas on the other hand, black has managed to kind of complete his development a little bit more thoroughly than we saw Jan be able to do. Now in the game, knight takes c3, bishop takes c3, and bishop d5 came on the board. And this is quite nasty stuff, actually, by Tal. Sort of the whole point of white's play is to kind of establish a monster bishop on the g2 square, staring down the long open diagonal, and with bishop d5, Tal is very much saying, yes, you have failed to do that. I will contest this bishop, and you will get nothing for your efforts. Now, in this game, I mentioned this idea of d4 in Fabi's game, and mentioned that it was sort of a big mistake for Fabi in that case. However, in this game, I think it would have been a slightly different story. There is really one very particular instance where the move e4 is playable for white in these cases, and that instance is when you can immediately follow it up with the move d4. And this is one of those cases. So if e4, bishop back to f7, for example, the move b5, the move knight b8, we're not actually going to take the time to defend this pawn. Instead, we are very much going to play the move d4. And this is perhaps something that Yasser could have considered. Maybe he did consider. Obviously, there's a lot of reasons not to go for it. You sort of leave your entire queenside on prise. But in general, if you can get both e4 and d4 in, it is going to be very advantageous for white. For example, e takes d4, knight takes d4, and already you're eyeing some very key squares, such as the f5 square. Also eyeing ideas like e5 for yourself, opening this bishop, with some really crazy stuff to follow. Now, in this game, though, Yasser just plays the move queen c2, not ready to go in for this e4 craziness. And now the move a5 does come by Tal, sort of forcing Yasser's hand to play the move b5. Now, rather than a silly move like knight b8, which would in fact just allow a much better version of this e4 business, Tal, of course, plays the move knight to d4. And now after bishop takes d4, e takes d4, this is definitely a case where the move e4 is no longer going to be an option for Yasser here. Quite simply, this pawn on a3 is hanging, this pawn on b5 is hanging, this pawn on d3 might end up hanging. Too much to deal with for Yasser. So he plays the move queen b2, and now Tal simply plays the move c6. We had b takes c6, b takes c6, and now a4 by Yasser. And this is, as Yasser himself said, just a good position for black. Tal has the two bishops, he has the extra central space with this d4 pawn, and he's doing quite well here, in my opinion. In the game, he chose the move c5, which is very sensible, solidifying this d4 pawn. Yasser continued with the move queen c2. We had rook a b8, seizing the open file, knight back to d2 for Yasser, and now bishop back to e6 for Tal. And perhaps this is a case where Tal was playing for a bit too much. Maybe he should have actually just captured on the g2 square and gone in for something like rook b4 with just a very pleasant position. Instead, though, he does keep these bishops on the board, which perhaps he may live to regret. Yasser now continues very simply with rook b1, contesting the open file, but Tal does manage to keep the open file with the move rook b4, and now Yasser plays a very, very sad move, and that sad move is rook takes b4, allowing c takes b4 with a protected passed pawn for black. Now, what did he get in exchange for it? Well, he gets the open file, and this is a great way of playing for Yasser here, because he's actually in a slight disadvantage in this game. So he traded sort of just an objectively bad position for a position where, yeah, black definitely has a really nice pawn on b4, and this is going to make life very difficult for white. And in fact, black is probably doing better than white in this case, but white has something for it, right? He's got something. He's got a file at the very least. And in fact, the game quickly turned into Yasser's favor after the slightly nonchalant move queen to d6. This is in fact just not a very good move by Tal. Now queen b2 is Yasser's choice, revealing this rook, and after rook c8, rook takes c8, bishop takes c8, knight b3, all of a sudden, all of your pawns, Mr. Tal, are hanging. And what are you going to be able to do about it? It's not so clear. He tried the move queen e5 to defend both. Queen takes d4 is playable immediately, but Yasser even went as far as to play the move f4 first. Now, after f4, queen e3 check, king f1, g5 was Tal's choice. And being Tal, or facing Tal, Yasser was probably a little bit concerned after the move g5 came on the board. But it turns out this move is not quite as severe as Tal probably had hoped. In fact, the move knight takes a5 does just come on the board, and all of a sudden, it's Yasser playing for the win. So this is how you can sort of turn games into your favor. If you have a position that is kind of sort of just bad for nothing, right? Your opponent is just better in sort of every aspect. It can be really useful to give your opponent a definite advantage in one area, so long as you get a little bit of something in return, right? In this case, Yasser gave Tal the excellent b4 pawn, but in return, he did actually get active along this c file, and that's what ended up turning the game in his favor. So sometimes it's better to give up a lot for a little than to give up a little for nothing, right? Because then you have something to play for, something to look forward to in your position. And that's what Yasser does here. Now bishop e6, knight into c6, and already things are just collapsing for Mikhail Tal. Bishop c5 was played in the game. Now knight takes b4, gf4, knight into d5, hits queen and pawn, bishop takes d5, takes d5, king g7, queen b7 check, bishop back to e7, bishop e4, hitting this bishop, so king f8, queen c8 check, king g7, queen g4 check, king f8, and somehow Yasser has corralled this pawn. Now, rather than capture on f4, Yasser chooses to take on h7, allowing the move bishop d6, which is still fine. G takes f4, bishop takes f4, king up to g2, and there's no checks for Tal. Bishop d6, bishop back to e4, queen d2 was his choice, and now Yasser starts his big push to victory. Bishop e5, h5, king e7. Bishop back to f3 for a little bit of safety. King d6, queen g6 now to support the h-pawn even further. And now after queen f4, we do just see the move h6. And Yasser has a very fun game now of ring around the rosy that he plays with his king. Queen h2 is check. This king drops to f1. Now with the move bishop g3, and the idea for Yasser is to take on f6 and play bishop g2, defending against the checkmate. So not bishop g3, but rather queen h3 is check, bishop g2, queen c8 is threatening a perpetual, so king f2, queen c1, and now bishop back to f3. And the ring around the rosy has sort of been completed. Queen e3 check, king g2, queen f4. And believe it or not, it's this position, except it's the other side to move after queen f4. So an excellent game of ring around the rosy. Yasser, a professional ring around the rosy player, I do believe, and he does manage to gain a tempo for his pursuits. h7 now, and now queen h2 check, king af1, queen h3 check, bishop g2, queen c8, king f2, queen c1, bishop f3. The ring around the rosy has been completed again, and Tal simply resigns. He could have gone 2 moves further and allowed white to queen in the perfect scenario. But rather than do that, he did just resign this game. So an excellent game by Yasser that I thought deserved to be highlighted as well, with a slight connection to the Chessable Masters tournament. Hopefully you guys enjoyed these games here today. That is it for the Road to 2000. Up next, we are going to move on to some end games from the Chessable Masters tournament in the end game class. So stick around for that. Move on over. I think it's a different link for you guys watching live. Other than that, my name is Caleb Denby. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.